Well, let's fight a Revolutionary War. And here is our obligatory picture of Betsy Ross sewing the first American flag while George Washington plays with her kid. So, anyway, there could very easily, and there in fact are, whole semester long courses just on the war itself. Unfortunately, we have to cover all of U.S. history. Therefore, I don't really have time to go into a lot of specific detail. So we're going to fight through this war pretty quickly and then spend quite a bit of time talking about the cultural implications and political implications of the war. All right, so let's start with this nice map that has all kinds of things on it, and we're going to run through the major events of the war. Okay, so to start off with, here is Boston. Now, in April 1775, the Battle of Lexington and Concord happened not far from Boston. Close enough Paul Revere could ride and warn people, right? Then the following month, May 1775, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold's combined forces captured Fort Ticonderoga in New York. Then the next month, June, in 1775, the Battle of Bunker Hill, again just right outside of Boston. Now, after that battle, the British withdrew from Boston and, under General Howe, sailed up to Halifax in March of 1776. But, you will note, they sailed back again just a few months later in July 1776, this time not to Boston, but this time to New York, and they began bombarding New York under the command of not General Howe, but Admiral Howe. There were two Howes, and at this point, George Washington's army was in New York City. They didn't think they would be able to withstand the British army that was on its way, so they withdrew up to Harlem. There were a lot of Hessian troops this time that had been added to the British troops. Now, Hessian troops are German soldiers, sometimes described as mercenaries, but technically they weren't mercenaries because mercenaries kind of join up for hire on their own. These German soldiers had basically been rented out by their own government to the British. So, Washington withdraws to Brooklyn in August of 1776, and there was a big battle at Brooklyn Heights, which I used to live in Brooklyn Heights back in the 80s. It's a pretty quiet place now. Washington was defeated and had to retreat, had to withdraw from New York City, and he crossed over the border there to the colony or state, depending on which side you were on, of New Jersey in September of 1776, leaving the British in command of New York City, and they would be there for years. Now, let's talk for a moment about Nathan Hale, who was one of George Washington's spies. He was an American spy in New York City who got stuck there when the British took over, and he was arrested for espionage. And on the same day he was arrested, there was a huge fire, the Great New York Fire of 1776. This was September 20th, and it was on the west side. It destroyed anywhere from 10 to 25% of all the buildings in New York City. So that's a huge fire. There were accusations coming from both sides as to how that fire had started. Some witnesses said it started by accident in a tavern. A lot of people, though, said that American spies had set the fire intentionally to burn the city down so its resources couldn't be used by the British. Well, that may sound like an outlandish idea, but the fact is that several of the higher up leaders in the Continental Congress, Continental Army, had, including John Jay of New York, we'll be talking about later, had actually suggested burning down New York City if they had to leave it, so that the British couldn't use it. A lot of the British thought that's what had happened, and a lot of Americans assumed that's what happened as well, though Washington denied any knowledge of it. He said the fire was entirely an act of providence or, quote, some good honest fellow, end quote. Meanwhile, some people accused the British of setting the fire, British soldiers, to make it easier to loot the city. Well, we don't know exactly, but there were rumors associated with Nathan Hale, him being arrested on the same day as the fire, that he had somehow been involved in that. However, officially he was charged just with espionage and sentenced to be executed. And his famous last words were, "I regret that I have but one life to give for my country." Now let's stop for a moment and think about this, okay? That fire could have been completely an accident. In fact, odds are it was, because there was a lot of crazy stuff going on, right? But it also could have been set. Some people believe that the secret orders of George Washington. We don't know if that's true or not, but it was feasible. And it is still feasible because a lot of people had talked about doing just that. Now, Continental Congress took a vote and decided not to burn New York City. But the accusation was that General Washington did it anyway. The fact is, we don't know, but it's feasible. And if that were the case, that puts a Nathan Hale kind of in a different light. Some of you may have never heard of Nathan Hale. I find increasingly that my students have not. I remember being told the story of Nathan Hale more than once when I was in school, and he was held up as a great patriot and a great hero, giving his life for his country. But if he had been if part of his assignment had been burning down New York City, from the perspective of the British and even some of the Americans, what would that have made him? There's a word people use for that, which is terrorist. Now, I'm not saying Nathan Hale was a terrorist. I'm saying he might have been. And I'm also saying that whether you are a patriot or a terrorist often depends on whether your side wins. It's what you're called after the fact. All right. Well, let's move on from there and get back to Washington's army, which had been forced, like I said, to retreat to New Jersey. And from there, they had to continue and retreat again over into Pennsylvania in December 1776. At this point, the British troops were chasing Washington, and this put the Continental Congress in a pretty dangerous position. So they left Philadelphia. They moved elsewhere. Probably a good thing. Anyway, Washington, after he had crossed into Pennsylvania, later that month, on Christmas night, in the middle of the night, Washington's army crossed that river again toward Trenton, New Jersey, where the British were quartered, having just celebrated Christmas, and they weren't all that alert. And this surprise attack led to a devastating victory by Washington. So one student sent me a meme one time with a picture of Washington crossing the Delaware, the painting we looked at earlier, that said, "America, we will kill you on Christmas." Anyway, so with that, the British were initially pushed back to New York City. But that wasn't going to last very long. September of 77, the British, at the Battle of the Brandywine, defeated Washington's forces and occupied Philadelphia. Philadelphia had fallen. Now, Washington's army, which he had about 10,000 men, withdrew about 20 miles north of Philadelphia to a place called Valley Forge to winter there. And it was an especially cold, harsh winter. It's kind of odd that the British were just 20 miles away, but they didn't fight all winter long. It was really difficult to move those wagons and cannon and all that other stuff through heavy snow. So ordinarily, armies took the winter off, which added to the surprise of Washington making that attack on Christmas. So they wind up basically chilling in Valley Forge, literally and figuratively, pun intended, for about 6 months. And it was a pretty rough time. In fact, out of Washington's 10,000 troops, about 2,500 of them died of disease or exposure, which means they froze to death, over the course of those 6 months. It was really sort of a low point. It was actually, you might say, the low point for Washington's army. There were some bright spots, though, despite all the suffering at Valley Forge. For one thing, several individuals arrived to join General Washington's army, including several individuals from other countries, from Europe, some of whom had been contacted by or been in contact with Benjamin Franklin, who's still serving over in England. We're going to look specifically at 3 of these individuals, who all 3 wind up being generals on Washington's staff. And we're going to begin with this guy, Marie-Joseph Paul-Roch Gilbert de Motier, le Marquis de Lafayette, or, as he's known in America, the Marquis de Lafayette, who was a young French officer at that time, a young French cavalry officer, who was only about 20 years old, actually, when he arrived and started serving on Washington's staff, quickly advancing up the ranks in the Continental Army to become a major general and command American forces. He had left France basically against orders, because at this time there were efforts to try to get France involved. And a lot of French people, including Lafayette, really didn't like the British and thought it would be great to help their colonists to rebel. But the French government wasn't willing at this point to go that far yet. So Lafayette sort of flew in the face of the desires of his commanding officers and his father-in-law, who was one of his commanding officers, to come and serve, because he felt that this struggle was aligned with his personal convictions. And in fact, after the American Revolution is over, several years later, he is going to be involved in the French Revolution. Also arriving, this individual, Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, or, in American, Baron von Steuben, who was a very experienced commander who had won quite a bit of renown for himself in the Prussian army, which was German. He also volunteered to come and serve, and he was put in charge of training the troops, who really, as it turned out, weren't very well trained. They weren't very well disciplined. They weren't very well organized. And while they were there kind of stuck in the snow, he whipped them into shape. He also wrote a field manual for this new American army, sometimes called the Blue Book. It would be the basis for the tactical manuals of the U.S. Army for a long, long time to come. Now, von Steuben was very popular with the soldiers because he was a gregarious, fun type of guy. In addition to being, kind of a harsh taskmaster, he was proficient at swearing in several different languages, and he threw apparently some ribald parties. Another thing about von Steuben, or von Steuben, is that he was openly gay. Now, this did not disqualify him in the eyes of General Washington or any of the people involved in getting him over here, because they were really happy to have him on their side because he was really the best at what he did. And Washington's attitude basically was that what he does in his private life is nobody's business. Well, the third person we will look at is from Poland, Casimir Pulaski, or Casimir Michael Władysław Wiktor Pulaski, for whom Pulaski County, Tennessee, is named. He was a young cavalry officer who basically whipped the American cavalry into shape. And he also, like these others, came because the ideals behind the struggle were aligned with his ideals. In fact, he showed up in the camp, met with General Washington, and he said, "I have traveled here to the place where liberty is being defended so that I may defend it with my life if necessary." And in fact, he did just that. He was killed in battle a couple of years later. Now, an interesting thing about Pulaski, which people didn't know and is a relatively recent discovery, when his body was moved in 2019 to a different resting place, genetic testing was done on his skeleton because there were some things that the people moving the body noticed that kind of didn't add up. So DNA testing and various other things indicate that Casimir Pulaski was intersex, which is to say that he had the physical characteristics of both male and female. Back in those days and up into the 20th century, not a very polite term, but hermaphrodite. I mention that now because it's going to actually come up as an insult later on for someone else. But he identified as male and lived his life as a male. Now, here's what's interesting, very interesting to me, about these three generals showing up and winding up being near the top of the military echelon and playing such huge roles in the refining and the training and the execution of the American Army, of the Continental Army. They're not American colonists. They're not American. They're not English. They're from several other countries. I mean, in fact, there's every possibility that von Steuben and Pulaski might have been on opposite armies because Prussia and Poland were at war more than once in their lifetimes. So they're coming from these other countries to risk everything for this, really at this point at Valley Forge, what must have looked like a pretty ragtag group that didn't seem to have a whole lot going for them. They were definitely on the ropes. So immigrants joining in, coming to the new United States to partake in this struggle. And when you consider the fact that von Steuben was it was sort of like it was public knowledge that he was homosexual. It was one of those things that people didn't talk about. Everyone just kind of knew, and no one really said nothing about it. the fact that you've got an openly gay man, and the fact that you've got a trans person, basically, that are among these three immigrants that show up to risk everything for the concept of liberty. To me, well, that's America. That's the story of America as it should be told, America as it should be, America as it was envisioned by Thomas Paine. And speaking of Thomas Paine, this crucible, this harsh trial that the Continental Army endured in that bitter winter at Valley Forge, really that was the time when people needed the words of Thomas Paine. Now, after the Common Sense pamphlet, he did another one called The Crisis, and this is how it starts. This is the opening paragraph. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country, but he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. So Thomas Paine wasn't out there with a musket, but his talent with words, his ability to inspire people, was a very potent weapon for the Continental Army. Now, like I said, this is kind of a low point, but it's also kind of a pivot, because as this is happening, something else is going on that's going to kind of shift things around quite a bit. Now, the Battle of Brandywine, where Philadelphia was lost, and after which Washington had to sort of retrench there into Valley Forge, that was in September of 1777. This next event was just a month later, so before the weather got really bad there at Valley Forge. So here, our handy-dandy map, if you will recall, the British forces under Howe at this point well, they had been in New York. Now they've advanced to Philadelphia. Washington is just outside Philadelphia, but the British forces aren't enough to overwhelm Washington. It's kind of a stalemate. Therefore, reinforcements are being sent from Canada. So if you'll notice up there at the very top, from Quebec, British forces under General John Burgoyne, known as Gentleman Johnny, quite the party goer himself, headed south to reinforce Howe in what was planned to be a two-pronged attack, a pincer attack, or pincer, on Washington's army. So they would be crushed. Washington's army would be crushed between these two forces. However, that was not to be, because Burgoyne's army was intercepted in upstate New York, in Saratoga, by American forces led by Benedict Arnold, who roundly and decisively defeated the British forces under Burgoyne, defeated them, captured them, and then paroled them with the promise that they would no longer participate in this campaign, which they made, and Gentleman Johnny, being a gentleman, adhered to. So this whole section of the British Army is taken out of the picture. Now, that's very important. If they had reached Pennsylvania, there's every reason to believe that they probably would have crushed Washington's forces, but they didn't. They didn't, and this brought a new chance. This brought new life to the struggle, and this was really the turning point of the Revolution, the Battle of Saratoga, because up to that point, the forces of the the United States, the Patriots. They got a couple of good licks in, you might say, early on, but for the most part, they had been on the run. They had been on the ropes. They had been losing. After the Battle of Saratoga, they start winning, and things begin to change. Well, let's talk a little bit more about Benedict Arnold. We've mentioned him several times already. He has proven to be an extremely capable general, a very good general. Won some very important victories, including here at Saratoga, which was immeasurably important. He was wounded in the battle in both legs. In fact, he almost lost one of his legs, and he was in a hospital for months afterwards and was no longer able to lead troops in combat after that. All right, well, Arnold, like I said, was a very capable general. However, he had some issues. One of his issues was that he didn't handle money very well. He was always in debt. Another of his issues was he was not overburdened with tact and diplomacy. He kind of was a jerk. He was a really good general and thought very highly of himself and didn't hesitate to say so. And in essence, he alienated a lot of people. He himself got very frustrated, especially after the big victory at Saratoga and the serious injuries that he suffered, that despite all that he had done, he kept getting passed over for promotion from what he considered to be less capable people. Like I said, he was not really tactful. He was not really good at sucking up, I would imagine. He may have had some basis for complaint, but on the other hand, the personality has a lot to do with stuff like this. Anyway, Washington liked him. Washington seemed to appreciate him. And after he recovered, the British, having abandoned Philadelphia and the Continental forces having retaken it, Washington put Benedict Arnold in charge as sort of the military presence in charge in Philadelphia, which was not a battlefield. It was a social battlefield, something that Arnold wasn't real good at. While he was there, he was accused of being involved in a couple of different shady money-making schemes, and he alienated some people. Eventually, he was brought up on charges for mismanagement of funds and so forth. And General Washington gave him basically a slap on the wrist because, again, Washington appreciated his contributions, but for Arnold, even that slap on the wrist was an insult. Now, also in Philadelphia, he had gotten married again. His first wife had died. He married an 18-year-old girl who was from a Tory family, a loyalist family, loyal to England. All of these things kind of put together may have contributed to what eventually happened with Arnold. After the fiasco in Philadelphia, Washington put him in charge of a fort in New York called West Point. That would later, of course, be a military academy. Well, while he was in command at West Point, Benedict Arnold went into secret negotiations with the British to hand the fort over to them and to cross over to their side. However, the plot was revealed before it could happen, so the fort wasn't handed over, and he managed to escape and get over to the British lines, whereupon he was made a general in the British Army, although one rank lower than he had been in the American Army. And as a commander of British forces, he's actually leading British soldiers against his own former army and his own former men. In fact, he even leads a raid of a town. He burns down a town not far from his own hometown. This did not make him popular at all. In fact, he is reviled in American popular culture, popular memory, as his name being synonymous with traitor. He wound up moving to Britain, where people didn't like him much there either, and then he wound up moving to Canada. All right, well, there are a few other individuals that I feel like we should at least mention before we finish up the American Revolution. Some of whom we've already talked about, like Benedict Arnold and Lafayette, as well as someone we talked about some time ago, Simon Girty, alias the White Savage, alias Dirty Simon Girty, the guy who was a loyalist who had been captured and raised by Shawnee Indians and led raids, actually led Shawnee Indians on raids against the pro-patriot people. And he also was reviled by the Americans and celebrated by the British. Another person I want to mention is this guy, George Rogers Clark, pictured at the left in his dress uniform, at the right in his daily attire. He was kind of a frontiersman figure who also happened to be a general in the now U.S. Army, and he was essentially in command of everything going on in the West, which of course at that time was what we now call the Midwest. So here's a picture of him in action, capturing some British soldiers, capturing a town held by them. Here is a map showing some of the major things going on out there, and you can see the British were operating out of Fort Detroit, and Clark, most of his actions took place in what is now Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. Now, George Rogers Clark was famous by the end of the war, but his fame would be eclipsed later on by his younger brother. Sometime after this, he had a brother named William Clark that we will be talking about in a completely different set of circumstances later. Well, let's also look at this guy, John Paul Jones, who was the very first well-known, famous American naval commander. He was, like Thomas Paine, a recent arrival to the colonies, moving to the colonies from Great Britain in 1775. He himself was originally from Scotland. He commanded several ships throughout the war, the Bonhomme Richard, or Bonhomme Richard being the most famous of them, engaged in several battles with the British, also was known for capturing British ships, merchant ships, and so forth, regarded by the British as a pirate, but as a great hero by the Americans and by the French as well. And in one of his most famous battle, when his ship and this British ship were just pounding the heck out of each other with their cannon. The story goes that the British captain had called over to him demanding his surrender, and Jones said, "I've not yet begun to fight." Now, we don't know if that actually happened or if that's an apocryphal story, but it plays well, and that quote has always been associated with him ever since. Now, over in South Carolina, we have these two guys. On the left, Francis Marion, a local farmer there in South Carolina who became a patriot leader, a leader of guerrillas. He was known as the Swamp Fox, and he was in action against the British in several battles. Over on the other side, you have an Englishman named Bannister Tarleton. Now you'll notice he's got kind of a weird looking uniform. It's green. That's because he was English, but he was the commander of what was called the British Legion, which was actually made up entirely of loyalists, that is, of colonists who were on the side of England rather than wanting to be part of the newly formed country, and their uniform was green. Now, Tarleton was revered by the English, but regarded as a horrible, barbaric, brutal person by the colonists. There were stories of soldiers being slaughtered after they had surrendered or while they were wounded, soldiers on the American side, by Tarleton, Colonel Tarleton. If you've never heard of these two guys, there's a possibility you may have seen a version of their story. I'm not sure how many people nowadays are familiar with this film from, I think it was about 1999, around in there somewhere, The Patriot, starring Mel Gibson as a character very loosely based on Francis Marion, and then this other guy playing a character less loosely based on Bannister Tarleton. Now, if you've seen this movie, I apologize. Actually, it's not bad entertainment, but if you were watching it for history, it's not so great. There were some interesting liberties taken with historical fact, essentially to make Mel Gibson's character look better and to make the English guy's character look worse. All right. Well, after the Battle of Saratoga, from that point forward, most of the major action taking place in the war took place in the South, in Virginia and North Carolina, and quite a few battles in South Carolina. Now, I would direct your attention down to the lower left to this place called Kings Mountain, which is right there in South Carolina, right next to the North Carolina border. Now, there was another loyalist regiment commanded by Patrick Ferguson, an Englishman, who were on their way to join up with Bannister Tarleton when the Patriot forces found out that they were in the area, and they sent a force to intercept them, and they caught up with them at Kings Mountain. Now, this was a very important battle. Also, it was the largest and most important battle to involve almost all colonists, right? So the people on both sides, for the most part, except for a few exceptions, were people from the colonies, except some of them favored England and some of them favored the United States. This battle took place in 1780, and also significant about it, it included a large number of Overmountain men. That's those people who had settled west of the Appalachian mountain chain in what then was parts of Virginia and North Carolina, but would later be West Virginia and East Tennessee. So these frontiersmen, essentially, were a large part of the force that fought and soundly defeated the British. Ferguson himself was killed. Soundly defeated the British at Kings Mountain. Actually, if I remember correctly, I think that I had 3 ancestors on the side of the Patriots in that battle. Now, today, you can go to Sycamore Shoals State Park, which is important for a lot of reasons. It's a lot of stuff happened there in regards to the Cherokees, but Sycamore Shoals was the place where the Overmountain men mustered up. It's where they all met together to then embark and head for Kings Mountain, right there in Elizabethton, Tennessee, and there's a statue commemorating that you can still find there today. All right, well, 1781, the Battle of Yorktown. By this point, the commander of the British forces was no longer Howe, but Lord Cornwallis. And Lord Cornwallis and his troops were in Yorktown, Virginia, right there along the York River, when they were surrounded. Now you'll notice that there are American troops coming at them on the right from the south, and French troops coming at them from the west. France had finally entered the war on the side of the United States. Well, Cornwallis was waiting for provisions and reinforcements to arrive by ship from the British Navy. Unfortunately for him, the French Navy was also involved, and they had a fleet right there that prevented the British ships from being able to get there to resupply the British or to bring reinforcements. Therefore, Cornwallis had no choice but to surrender, and his men were captured and paroled. And this was essentially the end of the war. It was another couple of years before the diplomatic stuff was hashed out, but this was the end of the fighting. When Cornwallis surrendered to George Washington, the British band there played a song, a popular song at the time, called "The World Turned Upside Down." And that is how it must have seemed to those British soldiers who were supposed to be the finest troops in the world, operating as part of essentially like the most powerful nation in the world, defeated now by this group of upstart colonists. All right, well, that was the end of the fighting. The end of the war came in the Treaty of Paris, just like the French and Indian War 20 years earlier. 1783 this time, not 1763. And when all was said and done, the United States was made up not only of the 13 colonies, but also all that land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, what's now the Midwest and much of the American South. And the United States is foursquare on its feet as a secure and new nation.